Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. What is a shaman? It's a word that sits at the junction of spirituality, anthropology and counterculture, claimed by indigenous traditions, studied by academics and reimagined by Western seekers looking for alternatives to modern life. Over the last century, shamanism has been embraced by artists, hippies, psychonauts and spiritual rebels. Shamans appeared in underground books, psychedelic record sleeves, in communes and consciousness-raising circles. Psychedelics framed as a kind of modern shamanic initiation rites at times. But as shamanism was absorbed into this Western counterculture, it was also lifted out of its original culture. And the messy realities of land, lineage, service to the community and sometimes danger were replaced by personal visions, journeys and transformations. My guest today is Max Carocci, a social anthropologist whose work over decades has looked at how this has happened. And his new book, his amazing new book, Shamans, the Visual Culture, shows something of the shamanic world with an extraordinary eclectic array of shamanic objects, tools, clothing and images, and how shamans have made images themselves or been photographed, filmed and mythologized. It sent me into a slightly altered state just looking at it. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Max.
Thank you for welcoming here.
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
My name is pronounced correct.
Congratulations on this book. It's the visual culture of shamans, but also I think we need to talk about what shamans are. But before we're going to do that, we're going to talk about what you are. Who are you?
Well, as you said at the beginning, I'm a social anthropologist. I've been mostly concentrating on the study of cultures from the indigenous Americas, or Native Americans, First Nations, as you want to call them. Started my trajectory into these fields long time ago, already in the 1980s, the end of the 1980s.
Why? Why do you think it was that as sort of, young Max was drawn to, that world other than what we call Native Americans? What was it that pulled you into that? I mean, you're Italian, right?
I am originally Italian, yes. When I was still at school, I was running a series of workshops in a Native American art gallery. The only one in Italy at that time. It was run by a Native American lady. She essentially got me into contact with a series of cultures that I had never previously encountered. And so there I also met someone else who was running a committee in defense of Native American rights. I began my political involvement with this group. And in order for me to maintain these issues, I started studying anthropology. I went to the States, I went to Canada, I went to meet the people that I was supporting with my political struggles. The more I was studying their cultures, the more I was studying their spirituality, their religion, their belief systems, the more I became entirely enthralled.
You're an anthropologist, right? Are you also a practitioner of some sort?
I'm not a practitioner of shamanism myself, but throughout the decades I've been involved with Native American cultures. I've had several experiences that trigger my interest, really. Let's say that.
You're not just behind the wall of academia, you've got involved.
Yes, of course. I mean, all anthropologists, in one way or another, have to be in the field and experiencing what people experience and do what people do to transmit or, in a way, translate, some of the things that they've learned on the field for the wider public, essentially, and for academia.
Let's move from the Native American to this thing which we call shamanism. This is an interesting word. And it's a word that probably most of us in the West now have got some ideas about. But, what is a shaman? What is shamanism? Let's start off with that, or what it isn't possible.
Well, a shaman is a very complex thing, and there are, in fact, no agreed definitions of what a shaman is. However, we can say what the shaman is not. Many of the Native American experiences that I have encountered during my studies are not shamanic cultures. Several are, but the figure of the shaman is someone who acts on behalf of the community, roughly glossed over as healer. But healer is a bit of a misnomer, to be honest, because the shaman's role is not just healing, is to really interact with invisible forces, invisible beings, intangible energies on behalf of the community and on behalf of individuals. And this may actually cover several different areas of social interaction, not just healing, medicine, and psychological or mental issues. It may be about hunting. It may be about links with the ancestors. It may be to retrieve lost objects. It may be about counseling. Any number of things that in many societies are delegated to specific individuals, such as the priest or the doctor or the philosopher. In the shaman, all these roles are basically coming together. And one of the things that characterizes a shaman is not just the ability to heal in terms of our medical sense, but the ability to willingly induce a trance.
In themselves?
In themselves. They are not what we would call possessed, but rather they detach themselves from their body and enter another state, which we call an alternative state of consciousness, where they can essentially interact with these invisible, intangible, incorporeal entities that may have an effect on the reality of humans.
So healer in the widest sense of, it could be healing an individual, yeah, it could be healing a particular situation, it could be healing a community in some way, right?
Absolutely.
So also acting as some sort of go-between.
Indeed. A go-between is a perfect description.
We use this word to describe possibly similar figures, but in a massively wide range of cultures, from maybe some Native American, but also Eastern Siberia, Africa, right? Even possibly in Europe, right? So what's the derivation of this word shaman or shaman?
Many say that it comes from the Tungus language of Siberia. Some, at least a portion of academics, say that it comes from Sramana, from the Vedic, from ancient Sanskrit.
It's kind of holy man, right?
Kind of holy man,
yeah.
Yes. It seems more probable that it comes from the Siberian, because in Siberia and Central Asia are the historic homelands of shamanism as we know it. It became widely used in Europe after European explorers started encountering these very strange figures that they had never encountered before during the 17th and 18th century. So the first were European priests, for example, or explorers that went into Siberia to describe, through their diaries, their observations, what they had seen. In the West, today, shaman is applied to people as diverse as artists or healers, even what we would call medicine men or herbalists or any number of other
psychotherapists.
Figures. Yes, exactly.
In terms of these figures, say the Siberian shaman, maybe a medicine man or a witch or an African healer, is there something in common between these figures in terms of, your categories of sort of healing, animism, journeys to other planes, which we've stuck this word onto, and it's an approximation, but is there something between these cultures that we do share?
Yes, there is. But there are some distinctions. So, for example, when people talk about African shamans, otherwise would be called healers or medicine people. These medicine people not necessarily go into a trance like a shaman. There are many academics and scholars that argue that the term shaman should just simply be used to describe essentially the Siberian societies. Although healing is essentially the common denominator that cuts across all these cultural differences, so a healer is one thing, but doesn't perform all these other social roles that a shaman has. And the very fact that sometimes a shaman is translated with witch doctor, for example, which is obviously a misnomer, again, because of Eurocentric ways of perceiving these figures and these characters.
Yeah, because witch itself, I suppose, was a kind of a slur, wasn't it, in the time that it was being used?
Of course.
I mean, now we might think quite differently about those terms, but
absolutely,
when witch was first started to use, it was an insult, basically.
Absolutely, and Europeans, and especially in the 18th century, 19th century, when they met these people, associated all these practices, whether it was a shaman or was a healer, with witchcraft, with devil worship.
Devil worship, yeah.
And witch doctor, which can be glossed as a as a healer or a medicine person, not necessarily constitute a shaman.
We can distinguish it too from a mystic as well. So a mystic is a word which we're also familiar with, which is, again, has got kind of a million meanings, but would have been a much more positive sort of attribution in the West, wouldn't it? And holy man, holy woman, right? That's not the same, is it?
There are points in common with shamanism, because the mystic is someone who actually goes into a trance, he goes into an altered state. But not every person that goes into an altered state is a shaman, because it doesn't perform the roles that are required of this figure. Saints or hermits and people of that kind obviously display some of the characteristics that have been described about shamans when they go into a trance, when they go into, detach their ethereal body from the physical body. But for the most part, mystics are enraptured, incorporate in a way the spirits that comes and inhabit their bodily.
And for a Christian, that would be the singular Holy Spirit, right?
Correct.
Of the Trinity. They've got God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit.
So, yeah.
The shaman is never possessed. The shaman is the person who may fight evil, quote unquote, or enemies that may take over his spiritual self, but is never possessed in the sense that it speaks on behalf of these spirits. He may translate what he hears from these spirits for his audience, but is never possessed. And this is what essentially made some anthropologists argue against calling certain practitioners in several parts of Africa, for example, the Middle East, that fall into a trance or are possessed, shamans. Because although the outer appearances may seem similar, and it's very difficult to tell whether you're possessed or you're going somewhere in spirit, the distinction is quite crucial. For say, I talk about the Zar cults in East Africa and the Middle East, where women need to hear constant drumming to be healed of some psychological or spiritual ailments. I would argue that it is the shaman who actually goes into a trance, not the person that needs to be healed. He goes into a trance in order to heal the person. When someone is possessed, and if he or she goes into a trance in order to heal, he is not or she is not a shaman.
When we use this word possession, maybe you use the much more attractive word enraptured, but it's not voluntary.
It is not.
Certainly in Christian terms, when someone is possessed, they're not willingly doing something to an entity that's coming into them and taking them over effectively. They're being controlled, right?
They're being controlled, and the shaman is always in control. He has or she has to be in control because he or she has to fight those evil forces that are causing illness, that are causing the animals not to be hunted, that are causing the weather to be bad or whatever it is. When the shamans are having these spiritual battles against their enemies or rival shamans that could be, in other terms, considered evil, they are never possessed by their opponent. Although some spirits may actually attempt this, the shaman display of strength and power is such that he or she will always defeat them.
My understanding was that the shaman was a figure who was on the edge of the community, possibly living slightly separately, because this is the go-between, this is the psychopomp, or, you might say, between the worlds.
It is a figure that is simultaneously at the edge and at the center of the community. You are completely right. And very often shamans do live at the boundaries of the community, but that is not because they are outcasts. Is simply because their power can be potentially harmful. And so they need to be able to manage their power in such a way that doesn't affect the community. So also they need solitude because of their practices to refine their techniques, trance techniques, their communication with spirits or invisible entities. So yes, they are liminal figures, we could say marginal figures, but they are also simultaneously central to the societies, without which, of course, the society couldn't function. And here we are talking about small-scale societies. We're not talking about large groups of people. We're talking about groups of hundreds, perhaps, maybe 1,000. These are societies that are based on oral traditions, that are based on the transmission of knowledge face to face, essentially. And this is where I think the visual aspect becomes important, because all the knowledge of these societies, including the shamanic knowledge, is essentially embodied and embedded in the visual products that emerge from these
And,
societies.
the verb which we often associate with them is seeing, right? Seeing. So seeing into the upper world, seeing into the lower world. And that is reflected not only in terms of images of those other worlds or other planes, other dimensions, you could say, but also in terms of this incredibly rich visual culture in what they wear, the objects which they use. It is an extraordinarily rich visual world. It's not art.
No, we couldn't call it that, at least not in our term, provided that we agree on what art is.
They're not just decorative, they're operational.
Absolutely. I think that you pin down the correct word, operational. Yes. I make a clear distinction between a representation and a manifestation. A representation being simply a depiction of something visually. So you go someplace and you take a picture. That is a representation of what you've seen. Whereas the manifestations are essentially those objects or images or iconographies that contain in themselves an entity or a spirit or a vital force that is active in the world. So many of the things that you will see in the book are objects that manifest those entities in the real world. And they are used because they are who they are. Vases, containers, for example, or effigies, guardians, statues, or carvings, etc., etc. They are there to protect, to discourage people from entering specific spaces, to help the shaman. So the shaman usually has visual manifestations of these beings on his or her coats, masks, shields, whatever, accoutrements he or she uses. And they are not there to decorate, but rather to help him or her to achieve what they need to achieve. Whether it is a battle, whether it is, retrieving lost objects, as I said, or whether it is convincing the spirits, or, the masters of animals to release the prey, or whatever it is.
If we sort of try and think of how would that be in the West? Well, we've got these images of, say, wizards with a staff, right? For instance, where the staff itself, maybe it's to help an old man walk along, but also it's got a power in itself. We see this from fantasy films. For the shaman, all the stuff which you describe and show, actually, which often is very beautiful and striking, it's all got some functional purpose and it's embodying something, right?
Yes, correct. For example, you see healing tubes that are used to inhale snuff that is pulverized cactuses or roots or vines, etc., that help the shaman very often to reach certain states. Very often they are carved into specific forms and specific shapes. They are shapes of animals or hybrid beings or composite beings that may have some characteristics of men or felines or of birds or what have you. The very process of, say, inhaling from this tube and making this substance pass through the carved body of this figure enhances the power of the snuff. So the character is not simply a decoration on an inhaling tube, but it is actually the being that you need in order to make everything effective, inducing an altered state or an alternative state, because that image embodies that particular being.
Is this what animism is? These objects which are shaped like animals and that they're used as animal spirits, at least, right? Is that what it means, animism?
If I can give a very crude definition, animism is essentially believing that the world or the cosmos or the universe is animated by vital forces, whether it is rivers, stones, whatever. But one thing that I would like to clarify is that animism is not a religion. Many people may think that animism is the earliest religion, when is an operation that projects back into time a concept that was created actually in the 19th century by an anthropologist called Taylor here in Britain, who essentially said that it is the mistaken attribution of spirit to things, inanimate things.
This stream has got a spirit, this stone, this particular rock has got a spirit, this tree has got a spirit, right?
Yes, although a spirit has some very Christian implications of Christian theology. So rather than calling it spirit, I would call it a vital energy or the ability of humans to interact with other forms in creation and try to meet them, try to understand their language. The idea being that there are certain forces that we are not able to see, but we know they are there. And we interact with them on a daily basis. Animism is not something that is entirely associated only with small-scale societies that we've described, those in which shamans operate. But it is something that we have also in our everyday world.
I mean, it's also in our culture, isn't it? I mean, you think about Greek culture with, the Maiads, the Naiads, these
yeah, of course.
They're literal spirits of the water, spirits of the wave, spirits of the trees. And Celtic culture too, right? The sacred spring, is animated in some way. This connects with the transformation, these motifs of transformation, humans becoming animals, becoming other things, right? Metamorphosizing, this boundary crossing that you referred to earlier. So this transformation, that's visually represented as well, isn't it? One of the most striking, mysterious to our eyes, possibly, things about it.
Yes, and when we're confronted with this kind of images, it's very difficult for us to understand, really, from, a scientific or technologically inclined mind, what actually these images may be. These are what I call manifestations. They are not really representations of animals or beings, but rather they are the embodiment of those entities. Perhaps, and this is a big perhaps, they also may be animals transforming into humans or humans transforming into plants. And why is that? Because in several cultures, and in particular in some South American cultures, the shamans are believed to be able to mutate into another animal, say, for example, the jaguar, and see through the jaguar's eyes. And seeing the world through jaguar's eyes, he understands and can speak to other jaguars. This is what we call perspectivism. And perspectivism is visualized in so many different ways by people in shamanic cultures. You have, say, animals with a human face, or masks that the outer layer is, say, a bird, and then they open up and they show a human face, which actually is supposed to convey this idea that whatever you see is never the essence, is never what you get. So you always have to be very careful who you meet, because it may be, a thunderbird turned into human form, but actually when it sheds, the outer form shows its real essence.
Orkilaso gudyesusuda miyi sumbia kere chim khutbo chim khaiwada taida dia sianda khaiwa ya yaoria khaiwa jareoria da balana bibu khon bimchanil anana umbuida jareoria anana umbuida ya yaoria.
In oral traditions all over the world, you have stories of people mutating and transmutating. Perhaps they have roots in what we call shamanic belief systems.
It does remind me somewhat of like alchemical images, where you see these transformations, these strange hybrid creatures, half one thing, half another thing, might seem impossible creatures. That's kind of maybe the nearest thing that we've got to it. Transformation's an interesting word here because maybe it shares the same root as trance. I don't know.
That's an interesting proposition.
I'm not actually a linguist, so I wouldn't actually know that. But let's talk about trance, Max, the shamanic trance in particular, which often is connected with drumming. How does it work? And like for the shaman, he or her, you say they voluntarily go into a trance on behalf of the community, or possibly on behalf of an individual.
Contemporary circles, the drum has become the quintessential shamanic instrument, but it's by no means the only instrument that shamans use to induce a trance. In several parts of South America, for example, is rattles. It's not drums. Drums are used usually in Siberia, North America, in the European Arctic, among the Sami, for example, and other Siberian societies. There have been some very interesting studies conducted by Russian scholars in the 1960s and 70s about the effects of drumming on the psyche and on altered states of consciousness, so-called, which help the shaman achieve this particular state. But this particular state is not necessarily just associated with the drumming, but it can be any number of operations that are repetitive. For example, spinning, repeating certain mantras or repeating certain formulae. And certainly it requires a sensory deprivation. You don't just simply drum and hope that something happens, but you have to be in a very deep state of concentration in order to do that. It has been proven that drumming can induce, a trance or disconnection from this reality.
A lot of people who go to rave clubs would agree with that statement.
Would agree with that, indeed. Drumming, yes, it is indeed among the very many practices employed by shamans to induce their trance, but they practice constantly in their own spare time when they are not healing, when they are not going into a trance, in order to refine the ways in which, or perhaps even shorten the time that it takes them to get into an altered or alternative state of consciousness.
Images of these other worlds or other planes, the upper world, the lower world, the middle world.
Yes.
Because that also is part of this wonderful tapestry, isn't it, that we see in these cultures?
There's something quite interesting about the visions, the entoptic phenomena. Entoptic phenomena are certain images or geometric forms or designs that appear on your retina when you are in the first stages of a trance, in other words, hallucinatory state. It's not a word that I particularly like, but, some may understand it. The very fact that across the world, much of what has been associated, the iconography associated with shamanism, actually reproduced very similar designs, whether it is grids or concentric circles or chevrons or undulating lines, etc., made some archaeologists theorize that perhaps these images are the result of these early stages of trance. Clearly, the fact that these similar designs may appear in South Africa as much as in Siberia doesn't mean that they mean the same thing. And that is because, of course, they are culturally specific. A sunburst may be a sunburst for someone, but it may be something else in another culture. And so the interpretation becomes, very locally specific. But what is also interesting is that the variety of visions or depictions, in this case, of what the shamans see during these voyages and journeys, they are very, very different. Very, very different from one another. In many cases, they may be about the beings that they encounter, so the very faces that they see. In other cases, they may be simply mapping the trajectory in, say, the underworld or in the world of the spirits, or to retrieve those lost objects that I mentioned earlier. So you have a panoply of imagery that reveal a very, very exuberant iconography and world, one that is not necessarily structured along the axis above, center, and below. You have voyages that essentially just are on the same plane, but connects different previously unconnected parts of the universe in what some shamans, at least in South America, call the mesh, or a net that envelops everything and everyone. So one of the images that actually reappears in the book is precisely this net, which the shamans or the native people of the Amazon Shipibo and Conibo call kene. Kene is this mesh, this net that envelops every human and everything in the cosmos. And the shamans are able to see it. When they go into a trance, they're able to see this net, and they're able to identify whether this net has been damaged or not. And if the damage has been done, he is there to basically weave it back together through his singing. So he sings this net back into being and restores the balance that has been lost.
Which could mean it brings harmony back to the community in some way.
Absolutely.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about these entities that have been depicted and also experienced and, communicated with, battled with, you said sometimes. What is the cosmology of the shaman? Who are these entities, or what are these entities? And paint a picture for us of this kind of shamanic universe. There is some common themes in it. What is it like?
What is it like? There is an impossibility in describing this because, unlike scientists, shamans are concerned with the unexpected. They may actually encounter familiar spirits or familiar evil or entities that appear or exist in the oral traditions of that particular culture, but they may also encounter things that they have never previously experienced. And this is where the shaman becomes useful to the community, precisely because it actually deals with the unexpected. Whereas the scientist is looking for regularity and the ability to reproduce the same conditions, it's very unlikely that the shamans are going to find the same conditions in their outer journeys. And therefore, what it looks like is very difficult to describe unless you hear the shaman talk about what it is. Obviously, these may be entities with different purposes. I don't want to call them evil necessarily, because obviously evil is a very relative position. If you see the world through the eyes of a jaguar, a human is actually evil.
Or lunch, depending on what condition that human's in, right?
Exactly.
So nature isn't evil in the sense that we understand evil, although nature can be cruel and brutal and all those things, right? So you're saying that these entities, they may be malevolent in some way, but they may just be in the way that nature's terrifying, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Some of these entities may actually exist in the cosmos somewhere, in the cosmos of the Inuit, in the cosmos of the sun, in the cosmos of the Yukagir, whoever it is, whatever society we're talking about. But there may be also other ones that I've never seen. Shamans have been associated with what we call remote viewing. So they have the ability to see things, in places that they've never been. Just to go back to what this cosmology may look like, if of course the shaman goes to a place that they've never seen, they can only describe what they've seen, but it doesn't belong to iconographic landscape, we could say, that is part and parcel of that oral tradition.
As an anthropologist, is it possible to interpret what these entities might be? I don't want to be like reducing them into some familiar psychological or even scientific terms, as forces or whatever. But what's your understanding of what these or who these entities are? You're not a shaman yourself, but you're looking at them from above, as it were. And what's your interpretation of what they might be?
One could say projections, maybe, or the necessity to pin down on something that isn't familiar and give it a name, give it a form, give it a shape, so that people can understand. Is the same principle as if those religions in which the icons are the manifestation of a particular concept. Imagine the avatars in Hinduism, for example, or the god of this or the god of that, simply because the human mind cannot really conceptualize something unless it is perhaps
personified in some way. And it becomes more graspable. Yeah. And of course, it could be that there are actually entities out there, right, as well.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, we don't have to sort of close that possibility down too. Max, what about psychoactive plants and shamanism? You mentioned it a couple of times. So one of the technologies of consciousness, if you like, that a shaman might use to enter a trance apart from or along with drumming could be what we call psychoactive plants, right?
Correct, yes. They have been detected in many, many societies. Societies of the Americas are particularly inclined to use these plants. And they can be, as I said, from vines to roots to cactuses, etc. Not that they're only necessarily just used by shamans, but they're not the condition without which, shamanism cannot exist. You can enter a trance without a psychotropic plant. It is something that perhaps sometimes is required, and there are some forms of shamanism that very heavily depend on, the ingestion of some of these psychotropic agents. In the Caribbean, for example, in the Amazon, for example, think of ayahuasca or think about the rapé, all the other substances that are used by the cohoba among the Antillean people described by the early colonists, or the peyote that is used in Mexico, that Carlos Castaneda very clearly described in his books.
Wonderfully described, yeah.
Yes.
They've had an effect on the visual culture, both in terms of the apparatus, which you mentioned, say earlier, the pipes and things like that, but also in terms of maybe the representations of those worlds, right?
Absolutely. For example, I bring a couple of examples from the Americas, one from Panama and one from the Pacific Northwest of Canada, where I talk about the multiverse, and not a universe that is unidirectional and only has one dimension, but this multidimensional universe where all these planes of existence or registers of being essentially interact with one another. And visually, how they are represented by creating these absolutely wonderfully intricate images where there are beings that we cannot recognize in this reality, certainly, that are mixed with shapes and forms that entangle them in these very exuberant formations. It's very difficult to detect what is actually going on, but if you actually know how to see, just to go back to what we were saying earlier, you can actually detect that there are some elements that tell you, here you're seeing, say, a manta ray, or here you're seeing, a raven, but it's also part of a bear. It is also part of a killing whale. Why is it? Because the moment you start focusing on one of these elements, the other elements tend to disappear in the background. So you bring into focus one thing, knowing that it is part of all these others. And so this is one of the wonderful visual strategies used by peoples in the Americas that could be quite difficult to understand for someone who comes from our culture, but that quite clearly speak to this idea of the multiverse, of these multiplicity of planes of existence that exist simultaneously and that shamans are able to access.
And I think we all experience that to some extent in dreams.
Yes.
In dream consciousness.
Of course.
Where these overlapping things, and maybe one moment you're talking to somebody and the next moment you are that person.
Absolutely.
So we've all got a bit of experience of that. Just to look at the figure of the traditional shaman again, and these were figures who, to sort of become the shaman, had to go through some initiatory experience, often brutally painful or difficult or sickness.
Indeed.
You mentioned Castaneda because it was, in his own books, whatever the factual basis is, but, there's a lot of that stuff, isn't there, of going through a lot of suffering, basically.
Yes.
Is that the case with the shaman?
Yes, indeed. I mean, becoming a shaman is very often something you cannot escape.
Right.
You are called to become a shaman. And in many societies, signs of this attitude towards the world is detected at a very early stage, and you can fight it as much as you want, but eventually you will have to give in. And so shamans very often become practitioners after a very traumatic experience, a near-death experience, for example, or a very severe illness or trauma of some kind. And so after which, in a way, they leave behind their former self. They become this new figure and embrace this new identity in a way, is almost like leaving behind is that moment of seizure between your former self and the new self. And so this it may be also repetitive episodes that may happen to you over a period of several years until you can no longer ignore them, and therefore you embrace this new role. But very often, in some societies, at least in Central Asia, for example, among the Turkic-speaking people's shamanism is inherited. So your father and your grandfather, etc., and you inherit their ability, but also the techniques. And so you are being instructed into how to perform, to be a shaman. But there are other societies where this is not the case. It's not necessarily inherited.
This is a sidebar about Galba, the last Tuvan shaman of Mongolia. In 2014, the photographer David Baxendale wrote a piece for Lonely Planet about a Siberian shaman called Galba. She was Tuvan, part of a small Turkic people whose land stretched across southern Siberia and western Mongolia. And when Baxendale visited her on assignment, Galba was already very old, and she would die less than a week after he photographed her. Her passing seemed to mark more than the death of an individual, but more like the quiet end of a continuous shamanic line. Tuvan shamanism is not a belief system in the modern sense, but a way of living in relationship with land, animals, ancestors and spirits, and shaped by nomadic life, hunting, herding, and an intimate knowledge of mountains and weather. These Tuvan shamans were not spiritual performers. They were practical figures, healers, protectors, mediators between worlds, much as Max has described. And Galba didn't choose her role. Like many shamans, she was understood to have been called. And by the time she was alive, that calling had become dangerous. During the 20th century, Soviet rule brought violent repression to shamanic cultures across Siberia and Mongolia. Drums were destroyed, ritual clothing burned, shamans were imprisoned, executed, or forced into silence. Galba survived these years, but survival meant withdrawal. And when David Baxendale encountered her, he didn't find a sort of public authority, but a woman living quietly, cautiously, Her practice reduced to fragments. She didn't advertise herself. She didn't seek followers. There was no school or lineage being formally passed on. And I suppose that's why she's often called the last. But that doesn't mean that shamanism ended with Galba. And since the 90s, shamanic practices have been revived across Mongolia and Siberia, as Max will tell. Rituals are reconstructed. Ceremonies now sometimes performed openly, even for tourists. But Galba belonged to something older. This was a practice across many generations without interruption. And those who spoke with her do describe her as being quite ambivalent about her role. There was no pride, certainly, in being the last. Instead, there was a sadness and a sense that the spirits themselves were withdrawing. When David Baxter Neal photographed her, it was beneath a tree said to mark her birthplace near the Chinese border. And it's an interesting photograph. It's very striking, but quite restrained. There's no spectacle. She's not in a trance. She's just a woman under a tree. But there is this sense of something reaching an end. After her death, she became a symbol, cited in articles, photographs, and spiritual travel writing. But there are no recordings of her rituals, no formal teachings preserved in her name. Just fragments, a photograph, a handful of testimonies, and the claim that she was the last Tuvan shaman of Mongolia.
There would only be one shaman in the community, is that right?
There may be more. And they may be in conflict with one another. This is where, the competition then becomes, evil versus good, or, whoever is helping who. But very often, shamans that don't seem to be helpful to the community are cast away. And so they end up either living on their own or finding a home in a new community. And shamans very often very keen to show how powerful they are. And so there are these tournaments of shamanic...
Is that right?
Yeah, yes.
Shamanic Olympics?
Yes. I wouldn't call them Olympics, but certainly, demonstrations of shamanic power.
Oh, okay.
So what you can do, and people go, this is what, this shaman can do.
There's sort of two things to that, because in a sense, the traditions that you mainly talk about, have survived in some places. I mean, it's quite interesting talking about the Soviet Union. So, Soviet Union, a secular, totalitarian regime, crushed as much as possible the kind of native belief systems, in favour of the new socialist realism. It did manage to survive in some places. Other parts of the world, there was more sort of continuity, I guess, in South America. What's great to read about is that in places like the ex-Soviet Union, that there's been a resurgence. So maybe it survived in some way, and it's certainly kind of grown again. So on one hand, you've got the lineage is still there in certain parts of the world. And then separate to that, we've got what you might call Western shamanism, which is the yoga studio, festivals, retreats, ayahuasca ceremonies. You could say, is that one's continuity and one's appropriation, right? And I don't mean that's necessarily a bad thing, but we've looked at these traditions and we've sort of cherry-picked a little bit, plucked certain things which we're comfortable with and which are kind of appealing. We've left the context behind. I suppose that's what I mean.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right, and I think that this metaphor of cherry picking is perfectly fitting, if anything, because shamanism, as understood for the most part by Western audiences or Euro-American audiences or cosmopolitan audiences, is associated with healing and with this message of individual journey, development, or restoration of environmental justice and things of that kind. All good, but what we don't actually realize is that shamans are also people that can create havoc and that generate, quite a lot of suffering. What we, until now, we've called evil shamans. And the idea of cherry picking certainly is true in some quarters. Those who can more or less legitimately claim on a genealogy of shamanism, at least in Europe, say, for example, in some Scandinavian countries, or, the Finno-Ugrian world, Hungarian, Finnish, Estonians, etc., which have a direct, link to shamanic practice, have recovered some of these practices in their almost entirety, whatever is possible to recover from what is known. What is more troubling is when shamanism is reduced to a practice that anyone can do in 3 easy steps, and that is the most problematic one, because in order to actually become a shaman, and I have been to shamanic retreats and things of that kind, and I've actually realized that what is left behind is years and years and years of very hard apprenticeship.
Possibly lifetimes of echoing back through time of ancestors. You talk about being passed on from father to son, mother to daughter. That's all not there, is it?
It's absolutely not there. I mean, some sell you shamanism, with 3 days drumming practice and an altered state, and then you become
you can get a certificate,
and you become a shaman. But in fact, shamans that actually go through their life, going through very difficult patches, would disagree that this is what counts as shamanism today.
And also, as you say, a shaman might be destructive, or at least a trickster. A trickster is neither good nor bad, right? But a disruptor, we might call it these days.
Absolutely.
A disruptive force, right, too.
Yeah.
We're not so keen on that aspect of shamanism,
no,
right, either.
Certainly not.
We see it in terms of an add-on to our menu of well-being and personal development, I suppose.
Absolutely. And also there's another aspect, which is the aspect that very often a shaman doesn't want to be a shaman.
Right.
You don't want to to carry this burden throughout your life.
Right.
Because you are actually in danger every time you engage, a journey in an outer world. You don't know who you're going to meet, so you kind of just simply, willingly, go into a journey thinking, oh yes, I'm going to meet my, spirit guide, as
Right.
we are often sold.
It could be a dangerous, risky affair.
Entirely.
Yeah, and unpleasant and painful. Yeah.
Unpleasant
And
painful.
you do said it early on that certain artists in the West have been described as being shamans,
Yeah.
Maria Abramovich, and you're saying that's not the case. I mean, they might be wonderful artists, or they might be doing something spiritual or consciousness expansion or something, but they're not shamans.
I wouldn't call them so. Even themselves, they don't call themselves shamans. They have been attributed this particular role simply because, they've got something to do with spirituality or with the unknown, or something that evokes this idea of the shaman as a very exotic concept in a way. And is a form of othering, is a form of finding the titillating in other cultures.
Yeah. Obviously with well intent. We all need healing.
We all need healing.
Given our current sort of state of play of the world, we can do with all the healing we could get, right?
Oh, and absolutely. And I no doubt, artists have this role in society, warning us about the dangers and or giving us alternatives. And though shaman may not be a fitting, description, it could be a metaphor. It could be used metaphorically to describe some of these figures.
Given the fact that when Western culture encountered these figures, Christian missionaries and stuff, they were seen as being devilish in some way, right? Occultish, and the fact that has been rescued, those traditions have been revalued, is very positive, isn't it?
Yeah, there are several reasons why there has been a resurgence of interest in shamanism. One is, of course, the lack of spirituality in a very secular society, in our very secular societies. And this is an easy fix, so to speak. In places where there is a direct link with the old shamanism, of course, there are legitimate claims to nationhood and community, and recovering certain identities that may have been oppressed or lost, especially in those places such as, say Russia or the Russian republics, where brutal repression of former belief systems was quite strong. The idea of shamanism becoming so popular in the West, at least in the States and Europe, has been associated with the emergence of the psychedelic movement and the finding yourself, so to speak.
And ayahuasca
tourism, of course, and all the people that go into to Mexico, to Peru, to experience some of these.
Well, I've got a take on that, which is that you might try ayahuasca for a thrill or a high, but you're not going to get what you expect.
No.
It can destroy you.
It can, indeed.
In a positive way.
And you don't do these things lightly. You don't do these things lightly. And we are accustomed to, ingesting a pill and feeling better.
Or ingesting a pill and feeling high.
Exactly.
And Max, for you, you're an anthropologist, you are an academic, produce this beautiful artifact, and you're not a shaman, you said at the beginning, you're not a practitioner, but have you experienced it yourself, either in terms of the traditional shamanism or the neo-shamanism? Have you had personal experiences of it which have been beneficial?
They have warned me about the dangers of simplification. But some of these experiences also have put me in a position of doubting that the reality that we are inhabiting in the present is the only reality. And I don't say this lightly. I don't want to sound overly esoteric or mystical. I believe if we have to give some credibility to what the shamans are doing and their societies, we have to suspend judgment to a certain extent. Because if we say, well, all they are seeing is, a figment of their imagination, then we should no longer believe to be true any of the dogmas given to us by any other religion. So we are often asked to believe that there are certain things exist. Imagine, quantum physics. We are told to believe that, certain things exist, but we've never seen them.
Not only have we never seen them, we never will see them.
We probably never see them.
The only way you can even approach them is via the imagination. Even when you're talking earlier about the mesh, the interconnected things, or even the notion that the vibrations and, forces, talking those physical terms, right? It's interesting to read that stuff these days because they start to see these things that are remarkably connected.
Yes.
As metaphors. Quantum physics is a metaphor. You can only approach it via the imagination. They say that a particle is a wave and it only changes if you observe it. Okay, we'll believe you, high priest of physics, but I mean,
absolutely,
we can't see that in our experience, can we?
But on top of that, there's also something quite interesting, which is many of the truths that have come out of shamanic societies and animistic societies that have been, dubbed as, imagination or fantasy or whatever, or mistaken attribution of life to certain things, in fact, have been proven by science. The level of dynamism within a rock, what happens within a rock, the movement of, at a microcellular level, obviously means that the rock is not inert, that the rock is living, that there is something within this rock that actually is vital.
Actually, also in terms of physics, most of that rock is empty space.
Absolutely. So
it's made of atoms. It's all forces, isn't it? So the more you look into it, the more mysterious it gets, the less solid it gets, the more connected it gets.
We are more likely to believe in what a scientist says about, the constitution of the world and how it's made or what it is made of or what consists of, than believing what a shaman is going to tell us, at least, in some quarters. So, but what is interesting to see is that, some of the truths that have been at the core of shamanic belief now are being discussed by science, perhaps in very similar terms.
Max Carocci, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks very much to Max. I'll put links to his beautiful book on the visual culture of shamanism in the show notes and to his work. I have an experience myself with a shaman which I can relate. It was a shaman in the very unshamanic part of London called Ealing. This was quite a long time ago, but I was in a very strange state. Something had happened to me and I'd had some sort of crisis. I was stuck, basically. I couldn't seem to move on. And a friend of mine, who was also having a crisis and was stuck, had gone to see somebody in West London who he said was a shaman. And when he came back and told me about it, and at the time I was very sceptical about all this sort of stuff, he described what had happened, which is that he'd gone to see this guy and told him all about his predicament and what the problem was. And the guy had said, no, that's not what the problem is at all. This is what the problem is. And when my friend told me this, I was like, wow, because that is spot on.
So I overcame my skepticism and I contacted this guy and went to see him, and I turned up one Tuesday afternoon, and it was a semi-detached house in a suburb of London. And I went in there and met this guy, and I can't really remember what happened that afternoon. It did involve drumming, it did involve lying dead in the dark and with stones on my chest and belly, and it did involve me explaining my predicament and telling him the story of what had happened, to which he responded, no, that's not what happened at all. This is what's going on. And when he told that story back to me, I recognised immediately that he was absolutely right. And he gave me a task, or some task actually, to do, which I did. It involved travelling to West Wales and going a bit mad for a few days. And I wouldn't say that it was the end of my crisis or my predicament, but it was the beginning of the end. He was not a shaman in the sense of Galba or the Siberian tradition, but whatever it was that he was doing, or he did for me, soul retrieval, I think that's what it was called, certainly was very helpful, and I'll always appreciate it. And I appreciate you for listening to this episode and to any other episodes of the Bureau of Lost Culture that you have. I'll say specifically thanks to Ollie, James, Robert, Rick and Edward, who've been in touch recently. Very good to hear from you. Thanks for the suggestions. You are welcome to join them and to be in touch and send suggestions to bureauoflostculture.com. I will see you and hear you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these tales from the other side, from the counterculture.
Orada kangutsuzlar. Onun sakinge çoğu dekanı kemirek sergeç. Sonun olur terbiye ödülde şu. Sen onu çarşırga cavarı. Da